today I am revamping the roundtable discussion group. Today I'm joined by Right Ruminations. Thanks for coming on, Right Ruminations.
Thank you, Todd. My position, roughly speaking, is that of the new right, more generally what was called the alt-right in the most ecumenical sense. My channel is Right Ruminations, YouTube channel that is, and I'm also present on other platforms which you can find linked there. And I suppose that in its most synthetic sense, and this is not getting into any definitions, but simply by way of introduction to my position, the new right is something which combines certain aspects of libertarianism, classical liberalism, with considerations of various taboo subjects such as race or sex differences, and I suppose is critical of the the norms of the political arena, more generally speaking. So in brief, that's the perspective from which I come.
All right, I'm again joined by Keith Preston. Thanks again, Keith.
Good to be back. I imagine your audience is familiar with me because I've been on quite a few of your programs, but
probably
for those who aren't, I am the editor of the attackthesystem.com website. My political affiliation is anarchist. I'm probably the furthest left guy on this panel. I'm pretty much a classical 19th century anarchist with a lot of modern tweaks and bits and pieces borrowed from other things and then brought into a more ecumenical pan-decentralist umbrella. And if you want to know more about that, just go to attackthesystem.com and read the statement of purpose or all the material that's on the website. You'll get a much better overview of who I am and what I'm about.
Okay, and now brand new to this channel, Swithun Dobson. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me, Todd. I'm Swithun Dobson. If anyone knows who I am, I'm most closely associated with Mises UK, for which I occasionally write and speak at their events. Just note, views expressed here do not necessarily represent the views of Mises UK. And you could probably broadly describe me as a sort of a paleo-libertarian as such. So with the...
All right, well, that's great. So before we maybe move on to the autopsy part, why don't we open up with you, Right Ruminations, to give a brief sketch of the rise and fall of the alt-right and sort of your reasons for dissecting its fall.
Well, the alt-right is something that I think has a certain definitional problem, and that is that it has evolved in terms of about 3 stages. The term was first introduced by Paul Gottfried in terms of being called the alternative right, and then it was evolved into the alt-right as such by Richard Spencer. And during the, roughly speaking, circa the beginning of the Trump era, it evolved into something more narrowly ethno-nationalist. And then after that, after the events of Charlottesville began to inexorably disintegrate, I think that the 3 stages could, roughly speaking, be characterized as such. When it first began with Paul Gottfried, the alternative right was a kind of 2.0 version of paleoconservatism. That is, paleoconservatism had devolved into a kind of esoteric, neo-Chestertonian sort of reclusivism, and had left behind its more populist, racialist inclinations. I think that the introduction of the concept of the alternative right at the H.L. Mencken Club was basically an attempt to revitalize paleoconservatism in a way that was more politically viable and perhaps more ideological. From there, with the introduction of Richard Spencer, who was at the time a kind of protege of Paul Gottfried, the introduction of Radix and the alternative right website, it became more of a kind of general intellectual dissidence debate club. as it were, involving people like Andy Nowicki and Colin Liddell, and also loosely applied to things like the manosphere and neo-reaction. It was very much a kind of online, broad tent intellectualist phenomenon. Then, circa 2015, it became to very quickly be narrowed down to white ethno-nationalism, and was also loosely associated with authoritarianism. And this is when Richard Spencer was most at the forefront, along with, to a certain extent, Greg Johnson. After Charlottesville, this became even more consolidated because the alt-right as a term became so unpopular that the adjuncts, the alt-right, the libertarians, people who are more moderate, left it behind. And so it became more exclusively ethno-nationalist. And ever since then, it seems to have lost its momentum.
Okay, what would you consider to be the causes of this losing momentum?
Well, I think that there are basically three causes. One is the fact that there was a problem with the intellectual definition and therefore the conceptual integrity of the alt-right. Another problem is that it was the events of Charlottesville which resulted in a certain, or is perceived to have resulted in a certain public relations problem. In terms of definition, I do not believe that the definitional issue exists in terms that the alt-right normally presents it as existing. That is to say, I do not believe that the problem was that it didn't hold out any positive vision or it didn't give a clear image of what it wanted, but rather in a sense that it did not define itself in terms which were ecumenical enough. That is, at sometimes it seemed like it meant ethno-nationalism, at other times it seemed like it meant a kind of edgy meme lord libertarianism. And so as a result of this, it lacked the sufficient grounding in terms of articulation that would be necessary for any kind of ecumenical consolidation. The problem with the events at Charlottesville, I think, are not best seen in terms of what they meant for public relations, because I do not believe that anyone who, for example, would be inclined to believe that the alt-right were, say, Nazis or violent National Socialists really would require Charlottesville to believe that. In other words, if you were amenable for that kind of persuasion, it wouldn't take Charlottesville to convince you that the alt-right was a wayward movement. Rather, I think that the effect of Charlottesville was to turn the members of the alt-right against themselves. In other words, when the accusations started coming out that these people were Nazis or fascists, basically it led what is now called the alt-right to go its separate way out of fear of a PR crisis. And then, of course, in retaliation for this, the more distinctly ethno-nationalists on the alt-right then turned against them. And so Charlottesville, I suppose, it was not so much the PR difficulties as the threat of PR difficulties that served as the instigator for additional division.
All right, Keith, what are sort of, what's your, as the coroner, what is your view on the autopsy of the alt-right?
Well, I had the experience of actually being there when the alt-right really began to develop. And the reason for that was back in the, way back during the George W. Bush era, when he was the president of the United States, I became very interested in the paleo-conservative right, in part because of their opposition to the neocons and their opposition to the foreign policy of the Bush regime. And I had been following the more populist sectors of the right in the years before that, the stuff that was further to the right outside the Republican Party, not ethno-nationalism, but just general right-wing populism. So I was already familiar with paleo-conservatism as well as the populist right. And I saw the alt-right, the alternative right, as we said before, I saw that develop in the late 2000s. I first met Paul Gottfried and Richard Spencer during that time period. And I was a occasional staff writer at Taki's Mag, which Richard Spencer was the editor of at the time. And then I also began attending and then later presenting at the H.L. Mencken Club around the same time as well. And I'm still involved with the Mencken Club, even though they've broken ties with Spencer at this point. It's still, Gottfried still runs it as an organization. And then when AlternativeRight.com, which was really the introduction to, it was really the first online journalistic presence of the alt-right, or what became the alt-right, that formed around 2009. And I was one of the first staff writers for AlternativeRight.com. When the Alternative Right started, it was a very generic dissident right forum, certainly a paleo-conservative presence, some Catholic traditionalists, some people that were interested in HBD and human biodiversity and things like that, immigration critics, pro-life, anti-abortion Catholics, people that were interested in things like the European New Right and Eurasianism and the more traditional European conservatism. That is, it included all the different sectors of the right that you don't find in the Republican Party in the United States. It wasn't the neocons, it wasn't the Christian right, it wasn't any of that kind of stuff. It was stuff that was further to the right of that. Now, over time, as was said, it started moving in a different direction. It started to become a haven for all of the kind of alternative subculture right elements like manosphere and neo-reactionaries and a lot of things like that, or at least it started to overlap quite a bit with that. And then it started moving towards ethno-nationalism and Trumpism, and then the Charlottesville debacle and the whole narrative that's already been covered. I think that the reason that the alt-right went in the direction that it did was in part because there never really was a clear vision of what the alt-right is. It was sort of an open-ended, well, you know, we're just the dissident right, and we include all of these different things. And I think that over time, as movements often do, when they grow and become more popular, they tend to become more and more lowbrow. If you go back and you read some of the early alternative right web zines, if to the degree they're still available, but if you go back and you read what was on, say, AlternativeRight.com in 2009, 2010, or even on what was on Radix a few years later, and then compare that with what you often find in alt-right circles today, you'll see that over time the movement became much more lowbrow. It went from being highbrow discussions of political theory and history and philosophy to being people circulating memes about Pepe the Frog and coming up with all kinds of goofy names to nickname political opponents and stuff like that. So over time, it went from being more something on the level of Alain de Benoit or Paul Gottfried to being something more like Alex Jones or more like the MAGA hat people. And I mean, not to say it was that specifically, but it became much more lowbrow over time. And I think the more lowbrow it became, that had a spiraling effect where the quality of the people that it began to attract became even lower and lower and lower until eventually you did have people affiliated with the alt-right or peripherally associated with the alt-right with trailer park Nazis and people with swastika tattoos and that kind of thing just coming in on the periphery. I actually predicted way back, and I guess it was in 2011, maybe 2012, that the alt-right would probably go in that kind of direction, because I remember I wrote an essay on Alex Jones that was published on one of the older alternative right sites, and I predicted in that over time the alt-right would probably move into this kind of lowbrow direction, because that's just how movements tend to develop. The bigger they get, the lower the quality that becomes. The issue, though, was what kind of lowbrow it would be. Would it be something that was more like mainstream conservatism? Would it be the conspiracy-obsessed stuff that you see with Alex Jones and people like that? Would it be white nationalism or neo-Nazism or whatever? And it seems that the ethno-nationalist thing was the direction that it eventually went in. I don't know what could have been done to have prevented that. that is certainly true that the dissident right is not the only movement, left or right, that has ever suffered this kind of problem. A similar problem happened with libertarianism during the same period. During the same period, there was a growing interest in libertarianism, largely because of the Ron Paul presidential campaigns that had the effect of introducing a lot of people to libertarianism. And over time, libertarianism started to spiral into all of these other things. You had all these newer people coming into the libertarian milieu, interested in Ron Paul, and then they'd start veering off into the alt-right or into white nationalism, or going the other direction, going to the left and becoming social justice warriors or something like that. And that's played out in a lot of these online battles as well. So I think that's really what happened, is that simply the quality of the alt-right milieu or alternative right degenerated considerably over time, and there were a lot of different rivers of contamination that contributed to that.
Okay, Swithun.
I think I'm in broad agreement with Keith here. It seemed very much in the earlier days that the alt-right or the alternative right was a thoughtful, I wouldn't really say intellectually respectable, but at least integrity they had to critique basically egalitarianism with respect to sex, with respect to race, and I suppose related democracy to some extent as well. I think you have a marked change when you have Trump's run for the Republican nominee. That many in sort of the alt-right circles see Trump as their man, and then they sort of try to get involved in sort of practical politics where previously they hadn't to a large extent. And so you get the good 2016 meme war, amongst other things, which on its own, depends what you think of it, it can work in certain contexts, but they left behind the serious intellectual work that they kind of done previously. And also with respect to certain leaders, Richard Spencer, for example, even though he was veering towards sort of supporting Trump as his man and practical politics, he would never actually say what his policy, never say what his policy views would actually be. He would evade them most of the time. So nobody ever really knew what sort of the ethno-nationalist alt-right actually practically would stand for, even though they were attempting to move towards some more sort of on the ground practical politics. So you have a combination of, as Keith said, lack of intellectual output as they had before, and it turns more into the right stuff, effectively, the Daily Show, etc., which was pretty funny on occasions, but when it replaces an entire intellectual movement, probably isn't a good idea. And related to the practical politics, they were the alt-right or the alternative right were very good at, but how to get there was probably just to a large extent.
Okay.
Because they were on it, but it often wasn't often reasonable detail. But in my view.
Okay. Yeah. By the way, you're starting to break up a little bit, Swithun, so you might want to pop back in and out to see if you can fix that. But one of the things that I want to focus on here is, for whatever reasons, the sort of ethno-nationalist wing of the alt-right became the more dominant one. And there's a certain series of patterns that we've seen with essentially white ethno-nationalist movements in the United States that repeat a certain self-destructive cycle that we saw again culminating in Charlottesville. So we could look at the rebirth of the Third Klan the third Klan opened up with rhetoric of, it's about love, we love our people, we don't hate people, but then it ends up with the Greensboro massacre. Also, the neo-Nazi movement in America used the same rhetoric, but it ended up assassinating its own leader, George Lincoln Rockwell. So there's this sort of disconnect between a rhetoric for popular consumption of loving our people rather than hating somebody else. And then not only do they shoot up people they disagree with, like a Greensboro, they shoot up their own side. Furthermore, we had groups like the Order in the Pacific Northwest, which were legitimate homegrown terrorist group. They were the real deal. And they assassinated a prominent Jewish radio talk show host from that period. And so these self-destructive violent cycles, well, certainly what we saw in Charlottesville wasn't anywhere near as bad as Greensboro or the Order or the assassination of George Lincoln Rockwell. It's, in a sense, recapitulating that same pathology, which has a long history in, going back to the first Ku Klux Klan, because the first Ku Klux Klan was in part founded by Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. And once it became little more than a terrorist organization, even Nathaniel Bedford Forrest turned against it, sought to disband it, and collaborated with local Union authorities to hunt down people that murdered African Americans. So, if the founder of the Klan dissolves it and collaborates with the Yankees, how bad is it? How bad is it at this point? The other aspect too, even before I think what made the ethno-nationalists take over, to be honest, was when Hillary Clinton mentioned the alt-right. And what she meant in that speech were white nationalists. She didn't mean manosphere types. She didn't mean, neo-reactionary. She meant Nazis. And that's, of course, everybody's a Nazi started after that. So I think in part Hillary Clinton had a hand in that, however indirect. The other problem, and this is a problem that Keith Preston, you've mentioned a lot about with just any sort of radical political movement today in general, is you have this idea of the human capital or human quality problem. For the people, as long as the system is perceived to work by those people that are the sort of high IQ, low time preference people that are able to exercise, self-control, avoid pathological behavior, and work together in a sort of organization. Right now, most of those people believe the system works well enough. They may protest, they may get angry, but they're more or less satisfied within the current party structure. And anarchists and libertarians and the alt-right, libertarians probably have been the most successful in this regard, have not really been able to capture enough of these, shall we say, well-adjusted people. And so much like anarchists and libertarians, the alt-right was filled with a lot of maladjusted people. And so I think as it grew, to piggyback off Keith Preston's claim that as any group becomes larger, it becomes more democratic, they're only really appealing to people that are essentially pathological. People that are well-adjusted are not quite ready to give up on the system yet. And they didn't really have a strategy for persuading those high IQ, well-adjusted people that, hey, we have a much better option for you. And they tended not to make up, except maybe a tiny intellectual elite at the top, much of the alt-right. So I'll start with you, Keith. What do you think about those assessments?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is basically correct. I think that the alt-right was always sort of an open-ended movement in the sense that it was so open, there was no direction to anything. Largely, the tone of the movement was set by the individuals that had the most popular websites or the most popular podcasts, and whatever direction they decided to go in, you would have a lot of people that would follow them, but then you would have others doing their own thing. And then when I think the big change really happened probably in 2016, around the time that Donald Trump's presidential candidacy was starting to build up steam. I was personally associated with the alt-right from the very beginning, back in the late 2000s, all the way up until around the end of 2015. In fact, in the fall of 2015, I actually spoke at an alt-right gathering, National Policy Institute, and the other speakers on the program with me were Kevin McDonald and Guillaume Fay and Richard Spencer. Jack Donovan. I can't remember if Peter Bremelo was one of them or not, but it was a number of fellows who were well known in alt-right circles. Sam Dixon, who were well known in alt-right and in paleo-conservative circles and in new right circles as being, I guess, intellectual luminaries of some kind or something like that. And very rapidly, though, I saw this change happen where the movement did become about frog memes and all of these kinds of things. And then there was the incident known as Heilgate, which was actually the National Policy Institute gathering a year later, the year after I was there last, where Richard, I think unfairly, he was accused of doing an open palm Roman salute, a Nazi salute or whatever. What he actually did was hold up a drink and say, "Hail our people" or something. And then there were a handful of people in the room that did the Sieg Heil salute, some of whom later were turned out to be individuals that were actually Jewish, as well as an Asian woman who was there. We have to understand that within the alt-right circles, there's a whole lot of people who were, I guess we could say, pranksters or LARPers, or even to this day, I have a hard time taking all of that seriously. But I do think the alt-right over time, in the space of about a year or so, started to become known more for that kind of stuff than for any kind of highbrow intellectual content. My interest in that milieu was always in developing a form of conservatism or right-wing thought in the United States that was independent of the Republican Party, largely because the spectrum of the dissident right tends to have better views on international relations. They tend to be more critical of the corporate class. They're more critical of the existing system. There's a number of reasons why I tended to find them to be preferable to mainstream conservatism, as well as certain sectors of the left as well. However, all of that capital, that kind of intellectual capital, I think was really jettisoned when they started to go in this other direction, when the alt-right started to become perceived as simply a playground for a whole lot of miscreants. And again, I think that leadership was a problem. Richard Spencer turned out to be a very, very poor leader. I think over time, personal pathologies started to become more and more evident on his part. That's for example, since that time, there have been revelations about his involvement in domestic violence and some other personal issues. I also think that the more well-known some of the individual alt-right leaders became, the more they became to be about cultivating their own celebrity and just building an audience to have an audience and getting on TV and things like that. And really the intellectual purpose of the movement, or the political purpose of the movement, even was, to the degree that there was a unified purpose, fell by the wayside. It simply became a haven for a whole lot of YouTube and internet celebrities and things like that. I think that became a real problem as well. And the movement just lost its direction, and all the while it's attracting more and more lowbrow people. I think that some individual leaders in the alt-right started trying to push it in an even more extreme direction. For example, I know before the Charlottesville incident, shortly before that, one of the more well-known alt-right leaders published a manifesto that was essentially a National Socialist manifesto. There was never any effort made to try to prevent those kinds of ideas and groups of that type from overrunning the alt-right as well. I think there was no effort to hold the movement to any standards of quality or any kind of intellectual standards. And it more or less turned out as would be predicted in a situation like that.
Yes. Do you have any thoughts to add on that, Swithun?
Yes. As you make a good point, Todd. Most people who are well-adjusted and have decent jobs and decent incomes don't really see the system as a particular problem. So the question is, if you've got more of a radical critique style movement, is who are you going to attract? The libertarians who I know the most, and know them well, we just seem to attract the nerds That's pretty much the libertarian audience, because even if they're quite happy with their job or whatever, they're very sort of rational and sort of and want coherent systems of thought, and so libertarianism attracts those sorts of people. So that doesn't tend to create huge PR disasters, unlike attracting certain trailer trash, amongst others, who may take into other areas which would be less good for building a respectable, well, as a movement that has integrity and is vaguely respectable. Not that anyone would really consider the alt-right hugely respectable in mainstream circles, but you get the idea. So the question then arises, how do you get those people who are well adjusted to join the movement? And I think the only way you could have done that is by not dumbing it down in the way in which they did. As I said before, I think to some extent that dumbing down isn't a huge problem as long as you maintain the intellectual integrity of the movement and try and get university professors who are vaguely sympathetic and try and build the movement to some extent like that. But at least in the short run, that's not really very possible, just because of primarily the educational institutions, media, etc., just make it very difficult to get through. I mean, I don't really know the best way of doing that. I mean, it would seem to be the best is to keep running your movement, have the ideas ready, so when there's a crisis, you can present them and go, here is a solution. And then people who go, oh, hang on, we could have had a decent job, we might be able to have one still, let's try this. But I don't really know any hard and fast way of trying to avoid getting the maladjusted people joining more radical and fringe groups, but it's certainly an issue, and it's an issue with libertarianism to some extent as well. So that's what I had to say with that.
Okay, Ruminations, anything you want to add to this?
Yes, so I agree with your assessment, Todd, that what happened was that as soon as the term alt-right became a kind of household word, only those who were willing to live with the unpopularity that the term implied were willing to stick with it. So those who were perhaps more tempered in their disposition were quick to eject the term, and so that meant that the residue that was left over was people with more socially unacceptable views. So I do believe that started with Hillary, and then obviously it intensified as the alt-right became a kind of hate term for the media. Now, the interaction between the kind of populist, more lowbrow aspect of the alt-right that's being described here and the ethno-nationalist is a complex one, because yes, part of the problem is that some of the intellectual vitality got lost as the movement became more popular, as Keith has identified. But also, part of the problem was that some of the more elitist and more purist ethno-nationalists like Greg Johnson, and even to an extent after Charlottesville, Richard Spencer, basically rejected populism in the name of a kind of elitist hierarchical conception of what the movement should look like based on how they think society should look like. So you found a lot of the more hardcore alt-right exemplars throwing populism under the bus, rejecting Trumpism, rejecting the MAGA concept in favor of, I remember rather humorously, Richard Spencer said in a debate with Sargon of Akkad that he was looking forward to creating a warrior guardian class and therefore could not be amenable to populism. I think that and also you have with Greg Johnson in his manifesto, basically condemning Richard Spencer for being a populist, presumably not for not being a kind of suburban white wine drinking, or perhaps in Greg Johnson's case, a water drinking elitist such as himself. Now, the problem is not just, and you can see this with the kind of divisiveness you see from people like Greg Johnson with respect to cooperating with populists or the alt-right or what have you, is that the problem is not just with dumbing things down, because the problem is also inherent in the intellectuals as well, because many of the problems that existed with the paleo movement also transferred to the alt-right. And specifically what I mean by this is that when you get people who are highly intellectualized, who are independent thinkers, well, they tend to be very disagreeable, they tend to be very cerebral, they don't like to go along with other people's ideas, and they are people who are not particularly concerned with things like public relations. So yes, on the one hand, you have the problem of later introductory members who are not particularly intellectually sophisticated and not particularly impressive, that might pose a PR problem. And then on the other hand, you have the kind of ultra intellectual reclusive types or elitists or what have you, who really are so independently minded and disagreeable that they don't really care about the problem that's posed by the public relations. So it's kind of, there's an interesting and I think paradoxical interplay between the problems posed by both populism and elitism in the alt-right. In terms of what could have been done to prevent this, well, I think one thing would have been better clarity in terms of intellectual definition, even if it were for the purposes of ecumenically broadening the movement. That is, if the movement did want to be a kind of big tent opposition, it should have been explicit in defining itself as such. It's not going to work to have it be ethno-nationalism plus half of something else, right? Ethno-nationalism plus maybe some Jewish libertarians who like Pepe, right? That's not going to hold. So you need some clarity. Secondly, I think that there's a problem, and this is something I failed to mention before, is that as far as oppressive regimes go, this is one of the most tolerant, least repressive tyrannies that's ever been faced. I mean, if only due to various institutional precedents and due to the fact that it's such an era of prosperity. I mean, none of us are concerned that after we are finished with this conference that we are going to be dragged out of our houses by the secret police. None of us are worried that we're going to be drawn and quartered. In other words, even by 1950 standards, this is in some ways a very tolerant and complacent society and a very comfortable one. So I think that not only will some intellectual definition on the part of the alt-right need, or the whatever follows it, the new right, what have you, need to be in place in order for it to have some kind of intellectual grounding, but the things need to get much, much worse. And I don't mean that in a kind of silly post-apocalyptic accelerationist sense. I mean that maybe in 5 years, if more people have been persecuted for hate crimes, or more people have been thrown out of their jobs, or maybe the economy isn't doing well, there is not the pressure that is necessary to instigate a kind of ecumenical movement like the right in the Spanish Civil War or the left in the Spanish Civil War. So people still have the room to luxuriate in their intellectually disagreeable tendencies.
Mm-hmm. One other aspect that I think was a big problem and related to all of this was when we discuss the sort of ground rules for behavior and organization. So one of the things in The Way of Men, Jack Donovan writes, there is a difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. Being a good man has to do with ideas about morality, ethics, religion, and behaving productively within a given civilizational structure. Being good at being a man is about showing other men that you are the kind of guy they'd want on their team if the shit hit the fan. So, see, part of the problem is I think Jack Donovan sets a trend for, in a more sophisticated sense, moral anti-realism, where it's like if you're considered about morality and civility and getting along, well, you're just a cuck. And there's this sort of idea that, also you see that goes along with this is the aesthetic of violence, where even if these people themselves are not tactically minded, they like to, LARP as if they could be violent and are violent. And again, this is the antisocial way. Now, any organization that develops beyond three people needs to have a sort of set of ground rules, a sort of set of shared values and civility, i.e. being a good man. However you define that to be, there needs to be this shared assumption, is this is what it's like to be a good person. Whereas the alt-right seems to have explicitly rejected that out of the gate by just focusing on being good at being a man. And so, for example, the most successful revolutionary movement, international communism, that when you look at how these groups were initially structured in the very beginning, the kind of hedonism and sort of selfish indulgence that we find that marks the modern left, the modern anarchist movement, the modern libertarian, and also the modern alt-right movement, was more or less absent from radical socialist, Marxist, anarchist revolutionary movements in the 19th and early 20th century. While they may have preached free love as an endgame, many of them were de facto celibates. So, for example, in the book about the James H. Billington's book on the origins of revolutionary philosophy, Fire in the Minds of Men, on page 396, he mentions that Hell, which is the inner circle of one of Russia's most influential anarchist terrorist groups, required that its members make vows of celibacy. In fact, Mao Zedong, who became notorious as a womanizer after he became the new emperor of China, never gave woman any consideration in the revolutionary phase, because revolutionaries have to be ascetics. And the most successful revolutionary group in history, the communist movement, started off as ascetic. For example, Lenin was a workaholic. You know, people would comment that for a Russian, it was highly unusual that Lenin would work that hard, because most Russians didn't want to work. So that's a very sort of ascetic quality, that Lenin would be a workaholic and then give up all of these sort of physical delights and pleasures that maybe other Russians wouldn't, you know, like alcohol or whatever else that they were known for. And so by embracing this kind of practical nihilism, that moral questions are for cucks, and that we don't really need to have a well thought out way of getting along with each other, and that, you know, we don't need to have ground rules for behavior in our revolutionary movement, essentially kind of asceticism, they were not learning, they were not taking cues from the most successful revolutionary movement in history. You know, the radical socialist left in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so I think when you don't have that, it kind of creates this sort of almost, what was it, the idea of Max Stirner, where everybody has this mutually assured destruction option, where I think in Max Stirner's ideal society, it wouldn't necessarily be a war of all against all, if for only the reason that everybody knew that if you crossed somebody else, they would bring overwhelming force against you to end it right here and there, and everybody would make a rational calculation that that's just too risky to even begin doing. But that's sort of how the alt-right was beginning to drift. And what that ends up doing is it cuts at the very possibility of any sort of revolutionary struggle in the first place. So, for example, Richard Spencer said numerous times, where the alt-right is today is where the socialists were in the 1830s, which is roughly analogously accurate, I think. But the point is, how did the socialists move from a tiny group of cranks in the 1830s to running the Soviet Union? And I think this is one key element that often gets overlooked in the process. So maybe I'd be interested in your thoughts on this first, Ruminations.
Well, I do think that there is an analogy there in that the alt-right and the new right more generally, I think, has its appeal to the intellectually curious, in that it is simply because it is a group out of power. I imagine that if we were around in the 19th century, then socialists, even Marx and Engels, probably would have struck a more refreshing chord compared to, I don't know, some bureaucrat in the Prussian government or something, right? I think that there is an inherent appeal to people who want something different. But the problem is really, how do you transform that into something which has any appeal to people who like things to be trite, who like things to be safe, who like things to be as they have been, and perhaps do not like things to be interesting in the way that the various parts of the new right present themselves as being interesting. There is then further the problem of how do you bring it into the public? How do you make it something that is palatable to the public without turning it into something that mirrors what is normally seen in revolutionary movements? That is, if they are successful, they take over and transform the society into something significantly harsher than what it was meant to replace, which you see with the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, in my opinion, the English Revolution, and a host of other examples. So how does, and by the English Revolution, I mean the English Civil War. So what I would say is that I think that the best bet for the alt-right as to how to get where or what replaces the alt-right, which I can see being something called something like the new right, would be trying to take on the mold of an opposition or a rebellion, as it were. I remember, and I like this, in Chronicles magazine, there was an article, and I can't remember who penned it, but where it said that that leftists have revolutions, conservatives have rebellions, and he was talking about the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution in England, the South during the American Civil War, things of that nature, which means a couple of things. It means that, first of all, they're more appealing to people who might otherwise reject the revolutionary spirit, and it also means that they're perhaps less disastrous in their outcome in terms of not completely authoritarianizing society. Secondly, I believe that it fits with the open-ended structure of what was the new right, that it was an opposition movement defined more by what it was against than what it was in favor of. I believe that the strategy that the alt-right could take to, or the new right could take to eventually making itself available to the public, is to redefine itself in terms of being explicitly oppositional, in analogy to the both sides really in the Spanish Civil War, and basically cast themselves as a contrarian movement, as opposed to any kind of movement that holds a positive and perhaps dangerously optimistic of the vision, idea of the vision that they could impose on society. And I think that package should be essentially waiting for people in the event that things actually get bad enough and pressure mounts enough that they find the need to turn to something else. This is an approach that's perfectly compatible with populism or with more institutional forms of progress. My suggestion lies in that realm.
Okay, Swithun, do you have any comments?
With Spencer and being a good man, not being good at being a man. That's certainly true of his aesthetic. Although whether they actually practiced that to a large degree, I'm not entirely sure it was true. I think it was more LARPing on his part to a large extent. With respect to Right Ruminations' suggestion that the new right should become purely an oppositional, or set itself up as an oppositional movement, I think is fine, but ultimately will be incoherent. Maybe the nerd inside me, I go, well, if you're against something, it means you're for something. You're just not for what is currently in existence by necessity, because you can't be negative in a pure sense. It makes no sense. It's incoherent. So with respect to what the new right, or whatever you want to call it, could do strategically, I think it's perfectly fine to have a confederation of different positive visions who are perfectly happy to work together just on issues on which they agree. Maybe I'm just hugely naive, having very little experience in working in coalitions or anything like that. But I just fail to see why they can't just work on an issue by issue basis and agree on things that they're going to agree on, and then not. But what they should never do is go after some. Well, I suppose this is where it's more of a confederacy. Is they should never sort of attack anybody else, even directly, even though they disagree with them. So one of the classic things of English politics is certain politicians who are considered right wing in certain sense, which aren't really. For example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who you may or may not have heard of over there, who's an Eton educated toff, basically, and he's always doing as much as he can not to seem beyond the pale. So if anyone finds supporters of him who are suggesting closing down mosques or anything like that, he'll go out explicitly to attack them, say, no, they are not my people. You just need to state your position and then just ignore what other people in your movement agree when you're being talked to by journalists. That's the way I would work. I just say, I don't care what everybody else thinks. Just tell me what I think and I will tell you. And I think if you could work it together like that, I think that might be a better way forward. So, yeah.
Okay. Keith Preston, what are some of your thoughts on these observations?
Well, I have some experience with this because I've always been something of a strategic political thinker. And my association with the alt-right was somewhat unusual as well, in the sense that I wasn't really a member of the alt-right as much as I was sort of a collaborator from the outside. And that was always known among alt-right people. For example, even Richard Spencer himself used to say that about me. Well, he's not really one of us, but he's kind of, in our camp on these are few things here. Many of the issues that I'm interested in addressing are things that I first started to notice back in the 1980s and 1990s, and that is the long-term impact of the global economy on the working class in the developed countries, or the rise of this stuff that we call political correctness and the origins of that and the implications of some of that. I mentioned the influence of the neoconservative, neoliberal foreign policy paradigm, and a number of things like that. There's always been a range of issues that I've wished to address, and I have my own political ideological affiliation, but I've always approached it in a somewhat strategic manner. And essentially, I am a follower of Antonio Gramsci. Now, not every one of his ideas. For example, I'm not a Marxist, but I do hold to the view that in order to achieve political hegemony, you first have to influence the cultural milieu in which you are operating. It's not enough to simply say, okay, we want these political changes. You have to work to influence a change in the intellectual milieu. So the intellectual, I think meta-politics has to come before politics. In fact, that was one thing that I always found impressive about people from the alternative right, and that a lot of the more seriously minded people had an understanding of that it's really the ideas that come first, and then the politics itself happens. So I've always been very oriented towards ideas and towards developing not only, for example, the subtitle of one of my books is a new perspective, and I've also written quite a bit about strategy in a way that reflects my own views on this kind of thing, and my own collaboration with the alternative right was rooted in this. I mean, for me, it was a strategic perspective. There were certain things I was hoping to accomplish with the alt-right or within the alt-right, relative to my own politics and my own strategic outlook, which I think, regrettably, from my perspective, much of the alt-right went in the polar opposite direction of where I wanted it to go, but that's nevertheless how it happened. But I think that it's really the ideas that matter. For instance, if we look at in the mainstream society, if we look at political ideas that have become dominant or prevalent over time, we see that the intellectual foundation was created before the actual politics. So one of those is the neoliberal revolution. Many of us would probably be critical of the neoliberal revolution, at least I would. But long before there was a Ronald Reagan or a Margaret Thatcher or any of these people implementing the neoliberal revolution, there were thinkers who were involved in creating the intellectual foundation for neoliberalism. And neoliberalism came along and largely replaced the Keynesian paradigm that had been dominant since the early middle part of the 20th century. So the ideas were there first before the politics. The same is true with political correctness, or what some on the right call cultural Marxism, or what I call totalitarian humanism. But some of these things also had their roots in intellectual ideas that later translated into politics. For instance, a lot of people on the alternative right have pointed out that long before there was speech codes in universities, you had the Frankfurt School, you had thinkers on the left like Antonio Gramsci who were specific advocates of undertaking what they called the long march through the institutions. They understood you had to control the cultural narrative before you could really control the politics. And I think that's really the first step that any kind of movement has to follow. I mean, and a lot of thinkers from across the spectrum have understood this. Alain de Benoit makes arguments of this type. Ayn Rand argued this, that the ideas of the force that shape history. Hayek had a similar view. Max Weber had a similar view. And that is something that I think was lost with the alternative right, in the sense that the ideas have to be there, and the ideas have to inform the political activism that is done. They have to inform the popular culture that is done. For instance, if you look at mainstream conservatism in the United States, mainstream conservatism was largely responsible for carrying out the neoliberal revolution, which was influenced by, someone say like Hayek. But then the mainstream conservatives always talk about Goldwater and then Reagan as being their politicians. And then, of course, there was a more lower brow populist element to American style conservatism that included a whole lot of people that never heard of Hayek or anything like that. So that's really the process that's undertaken. You have people that develop ideas. Once ideas start to achieve hegemony in particular contexts, then they're translated into political action and into a more popular, and then they have a trickle-down effect, if you will. This may be a trickle-down theory that actually works, in the sense that the ideas tend to trickle down to the more lower-brow elements who sort of absorb them by osmosis, and it may perhaps absorb them in a way that they can't really even express them. And that's how any kind of movement that works seems to, or achieves any kind of success, seems to function. And I think in case of the alt-right, there was an effort to bypass some of those stages in many ways. It was rather than continue to develop an highbrow intellectual movement that was capable of influencing thinking people. There was sort of a shortcut taken to, let's just be about frog memes and let's jump on the Trump bandwagon and things like that. And I think that was a tactical error. Instead, I think that, particularly now, what's interesting is that mainstream American conservatism has actually become less popular as the culture has moved left, as the Trumpism has become ascendant. I think that as was said earlier, the alt-right emerged out of the paleo milieu, and the paleo milieu was about trying to critique mainstream conservatism. But mainstream conservatism has actually started to decline in terms of influence and popularity. So it's interesting how that void is something like the alternative right could have potentially filled. But I think they threw away their capital before they really even had a chance to get off the ground.
Mm-hmm. No, right, Ruminations, you had something you wanted to add?
Well, I did, and because I see that we're nearing the end of the hour, I think that this may also constitute some fitting final words on my part. Just in response to something that you said, Swithun, about the being in opposition to something means that you are, by definition, by consequence, in favor of something. My view on that is that the difference between being opposed to something, being in favor of something as a unifying force, versus being identifying primarily with what you're opposed to, is that defining yourself by what you're opposed to leaves the door open to a cooperation between a number of different positive visions, so that one is not excluded by competing positive visions, but is simply defined by what one is opposed to. And so there is, I guess, on a technical level, some difference between being defined by what you're opposed to versus being defined by what you favor, because there is a possibility of diversity there. I think that the problem strategically with emphasizing organization around positive ideas is that they can be very difficult for anyone to agree on. And so I think that the more people you have, the more people who are going to want to fixate on what their particular preoccupations are. Whereas I think that if you define your movement, broadly speaking, as something predicated on opposition to the managerial state or globalism or the cultural Marxist or what have you, I think that there are a lot of people who may disagree on a lot of things who would be able to get behind that. And so I am worried that much of the disintegration that has been experienced on the new right has been due to the fact that they are basically constituted by a number of different positive visions vying for control, when that would potentially be unnecessary if their terms were more defined oppositionally. I think that in terms of one objection to what I've just said that might be brought up, that I think needs to be addressed, some people might say, well, people are motivated by positive visions, right? People can often find purely negative visions to be uninspiring or to be whiny or what have you. I would say that, well, in that sense, you are correct. There is a kind of positive vision implicit in it, but the positive vision is a rather open-ended and imaginative one. The positive vision implicit in this is, we are that which is not this. We are that which is in the absence of cultural Marxism, which is in the absence of the managerial state, which is in the absence of globalism, depending on how you define these terms. And so my thoughts are that essentially the primary thing, aside from waiting for pressure to mount, is that the new right needs to rethink how it even conceptualizes opposition on an almost psychological level.
Okay, Keith, what will be your final words for today?
Well, I would tend to agree that when you have movements that have a positive vision, that everybody's got their own vision of what utopia would be or whatever, that does open the door for a wide range of conflicts. I know from my own experiences of dealing with groups from the left, I've experienced that, where you have people that just want to spend all their time arguing about what they're going to be doing in utopia, and nothing ever really comes of any of their ideas on a more practical sense. I think that one thing that was said earlier is crucial, and that is, we live in societies where most people really don't have it that bad. Most of us are not in danger of starvation. Most likely, we're not going to be, as was said earlier, we're not going to be dragged out and thrown in a dungeon somewhere or something like that, at least not yet. So most people don't really see the point behind having any kind of serious oppositional movement. And until the time comes where people actually view themselves as facing some sort of existential threat, I think at that point that's when you actually do get more people of competence or quality in oppositional movements, is when they do see some sort of threat, at least to their own livelihood, or some kind of existential threat or something like that. And until that time, I think, in many ways we're stuck dealing with lowbrow, marginalized, maladjusted people. In my own approach, I've written a number of books where I outline a lot of essays and given talks and all that, where I outline my own ideological preferences and my own tactical preferences, and an end game and all those kinds of things. For whatever anybody thinks of that, whether they agree with me or not. But I know that I have found that in doing outreach in terms of just trying to build an audience, it's pretty much a necessity to entertain a lot of fairly lowbrow people, and in a way that doesn't have very high expectations. I've had to, like for example, all of my social media sites, basically a lot of them are just forums that are very similar to the comment sections in YouTube. They're just a mosh pit of people arguing about all kinds of stuff, including stuff I could care less about. But that's really the point where we're at now. It's I think that the meta politics is something that's important at this point. Before there can really be politics, people have to have a reason to be involved in politics, and many people just don't see the need.
Okay, so we'll give you the last word, Swithun. Oh, maybe we lost him. You there with us, Swithun? Well, I guess we lost him. He did warn us that his connection was poor. So thanks again for everyone for appearing today. I think this was a really good start for the new roundtable. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast signing off.